Hey everyone, hope you're having a really good week. This week I want to do a little primer on the menstrual cycle and all the hormones that are involved in that and how it works. Because I know that many of us were not raised or didn't get this kind of education in our high schools. And so when it comes to the point of actually trying to figure out what's going wrong with our menstrual cycle and PCOS, or potentially trying to conceive, we might have confusion about what exactly is going on and what we can do with PCOS to kind of track it today. But first, I want to show you kind of explain to you how the menstrual cycle works, what's going on there, so that you have a really firm understanding of that, because I think that's the basics, right? And then next week, we're going to talk about what goes wrong in the menstrual cycle with PCOS. So today, we're just going to talk about what the average kind of healthy menstrual cycle looks like, so you have a baseline to compare it to, okay? So I've just pulled up my notes here. The menstrual cycle is very complicated, so I want to make sure that I explain it in a way that is from start to finish and makes a lot of sense. So when we think about the menstrual cycle, we typically think about our period. And that actually is kind of a misnomer. So the menstrual cycle actually is the entire period of time from one period to the next. So when you hear them talk about how irregular periods are periods that are longer than 35 days, it doesn't mean that you're actually bleeding for 35 days. It means that the length of time between one bleeding session and another bleeding session, or the start of one bleeding session and the start of the next bleeding session, is longer than 35 days. So menstrual cycle covers that time. And so you're counting from the first day of bleeding. That's day one of your menstrual cycle. And then the first day of your next period is the start of the next menstrual cycle. During that time, there's all these hormone signals going back and forth. There's estrogen, there's progesterone, there's LH, there's FSH, and all these things are working in concert with each other to help your body create an egg that becomes a follicle, that becomes a dominant follicle, that's then ovulated and sent to the uterus for potential implantation, or shed with the uterine lining at the end of the month. Okay, so the first piece of the menstrual cycle really starts with bleeding. And this is when our hormones are at their lowest level. So we have low levels of estrogen, we have low levels of progesterone in a typical cycle. And bleeding is normally about 5 days. I've seen as low as like 3 days be normal. And then up to 8 days can be normal, although that's verging more towards like estrogen dominance type stuff. So typically we're looking at like 5 or 6 days. And normal periods are light with maybe 1 or 2 kind of heavier days, but there shouldn't be clotting and things like that. So if we have any of those signs, it's a sign that something's going wrong in the menstrual cycle that we'll talk about next week. But 5 or 6 days. So during this time that we're bleeding, our body is beginning the process of revving up towards the next ovulation. So what's happening is that the pituitary gland, which is a gland in our brain that helps kind of control and direct our hormones, starts producing something called follicle stimulating hormone. You might have seen this on your blood work as FSH. And FSH is what tells the ovaries that they need to produce an egg for ovulation. So even in a normal ovary, we have lots of different follicles at different stages of development. And follicles are really just these like fluid-filled sacs, which you may have heard your PCOS cysts kind of described as. And it's true because there are very similar things going on here. There's lots of these different follicles that are in the early stages of development, and we don't know which one is going to eventually become the follicle, right? So eventually, during those early stages of the menstrual cycle, one of those eggs starts to become larger. So that follicle stimulating hormone is signaling to all of those follicles to grow, and the body sort of selects one of them, and one of those gets to be bigger than the others. And at that point, the body is somehow smart enough to figure out to continue sending energy mostly to just that one follicle. There's some exceptions to this, like in PCOS, we tend to send energy to a lot of different follicles, which is part of the problem. But also sometimes people develop more than one dominant follicle. This would happen in the case of like someone who, had twins or triplets or whatever. So your body starts to focus on one egg, and that egg becomes the dominant follicle. And so it gets much larger than the others. As it grows, it produces estrogen, and estrogen then kind of signals to the other hormones in the process that it's the dominant follicle and tells the body when it's ready to be released. So the follicular phase, which is what it's called, during this early part of the cycle where your body is making that dominant follicle, the follicular phase usually lasts about 10 to 20 days. You'll hear a lot of times that ovulation happens on day 14, but there's actually a lot of variation amongst women, even women who don't have fertility issues. There's a lot of variation as to what day ovulation actually takes place. So some people, I would say the average is between like 13 and 16 days. That would be somebody who is like very regularly menstruating, but it can be all over the place. And even in people with PCOS who do regularly menstruate, they may have an ovulation that's maybe a little bit longer than other people, and so they may be closer to that 22 days or even further and still be ovulating. That does still happen sometimes. So as this dominant follicle is growing and as the body's sending all these signals to it, the body's also sending signals to the uterus, and estrogen is one of those hormones that kind of signals to the uterus as well. And what it tells the uterus is to proliferate. So in your uterus, you actually have a lining of cells called the endometrium, and this is another part of your uterus. So it's not just like the uterus itself is actually a muscle. So there's like a muscle wall there, and then you build up this blood layer on the inside, and that's your endometrium. And so throughout the cycle, the estrogen that's being produced signals to your uterus to build that lining up, to proliferate it and make it more thick, because then it's more cushy for a potential egg. So in a normal cycle, this thickens right up until ovulation happens. And then we get to ovulation, and this is where a lot of things start to go wrong. So ovulation is really something that happens when the dominant follicle gets big enough and produces enough estrogen that it signals to the body that it needs to produce something called luteinizing hormone, or LH. Luteinizing hormone is this hormone that's released in kind of like a pulse or a surge all at once, like over the course of a day. And that surge is what signals to your body to release that egg from the ovary. So once that egg is released from the ovary, then it can like travel down, and the place that it left is called the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum is this area that then produces progesterone. So while the egg's still in there, it's making estrogen. That estrogen signals to the body to produce luteinizing hormone. And then once the luteinizing hormone triggers the release of that egg, that space starts secreting progesterone. And it continues to secrete progesterone all the way until your period starts again. So once the egg is released and ovulation occurs, this is what's called the luteal phase. The luteal phase is the second half of your cycle, and this is really where progesterone makes the biggest impact. So what progesterone does is it takes that endometrium that was previously kind of proliferating and getting thicker, and it stabilizes it, and it makes it a really great place for an egg to grab onto. So meanwhile, your egg's like traveling down your fallopian tube. You have all these like hair-like kind of things on your fallopian tubes that sort of push the egg down. I'm actually going to link you guys to a really cool video that they showed us in one of my biology classes that I just thought was so cool about the process of like conception. But anyway, all these little hairs are pushing this egg down, and meanwhile, if you are trying to conceive, like this is the opportune moment for your egg to fertilize. But nevertheless, it's traveling down, and progesterone that's being produced from that corpus luteum is stabilizing that uterine lining and making it a friendly place for an egg to latch on. So progesterone is actually released on a curve. And so you have your highest levels of it around 10 days after ovulation. And this is when it's a particularly good time to check your progesterone levels with blood. And a lot of times they will do this at fertility clinics to make sure that you naturally maybe make enough progesterone on your own, because some women don't make enough progesterone, and that can cause, an imbalance there. But around 10 days after ovulation, it's at its highest. Progesterone is kind of a warming influence as well, and so your body temperature gets higher, and this is where basal body temperature tracking comes in that I'll talk to you guys about in a little bit. But around day 21 of the cycle or so is kind of the sweet spot for that. And then after that point, if the egg has not fertilized and has not implanted into that side of the uterus or into that endometrium, then what will happen is that the corpus luteum will kind of produce less and less progesterone. It'll drop off. And as it drops off, that signals to your body that, this one didn't take, so let's release everything and have another period. If, however, the egg does attach, then what happens is that the corpus luteum continues producing progesterone, and it's really responsible for the majority of the progesterone produced until about 9 weeks of pregnancy, which is when your placenta that the actual fetus creates, that's when that takes over. So, I'm going to talk more about issues with PCOS and pregnancy and all that stuff in another video, but this is where a lot of issues come, because a lot of times with PCOS we don't make enough progesterone, and so that's one of the reasons why we're at higher risk of early miscarriage and things like that. There are other reasons too, which we'll go over as well. But you're kind of looking at this curve, and then when things look like there's not going to be any implantation, then the body sort of takes all those hormones and they just drop. So estrogen drops, progesterone drops, and from that point, that triggers the body to bleed again, and everything kind of sheds out, and then the process starts all over again. So that's the menstrual cycle. I hope that it makes sense. I know that this can be very complicated and convoluted, and I promise that over the next few weeks I'm gonna start helping us to make some more connections and just make more sense out of all of it and what's going on. Next week I'm gonna talk more about some different things that we can do to track our cycles and see what the health of our cycles looks like. We're gonna talk about basal body temperature. We're gonna talk about some of these different trackers, OPKs, different things like that. So stay tuned for that. But do you have any questions on the menstrual cycle itself? Anything that didn't make sense? Anything that you want to know more about? Please feel free to leave a comment. You can also send me a private message if you would rather. I'm always here for you guys. I'm happy to answer your questions. I hope that you have a really, really good week, and I will talk to you soon. Bye.